The metallic smell of fresh blood hung heavy in the Arizona morning air as Thomas McKinnon crouched beside the mutilated remains of his prize bull. The massive Hereford lay gutted in the rocky clearing, its entrails spread across the desert floor in a pattern too deliberate to be the work of any ordinary predator. Deep claw marks scored the animal's flanks, but it wasn't the violence that made McKinnon's weathered hands tremble as he examined the carcass. It was the message carved into the nearby Palo Verde tree, still oozing sap from fresh cuts that spelled out a single word in crude letters: next. McKinnon rose slowly, his 52-year-old joints protesting after 3 hours of tracking the blood trail from his ranch. The October sun climbed higher over the Dragoon Mountains, casting long shadows across the high desert landscape that had been his home for the past 15 years. Since Martha's death 2 winters ago, these lonely acres had become both his sanctuary and his prison, a place where he could grieve without the pitying stares of townspeople who still whispered about the night Mexican bandits had burned his barn and taken everything that mattered. The sound of approaching hoofbeats made him reach instinctively for the Colt .45 holstered at his hip. 3 riders emerged from behind a cluster of cholla cactus, their faces shaded by wide-brimmed hats but their intentions clear from the casual way they spread out to surround him. McKinnon recognized the leader immediately, a lean man with pale eyes and a scar running from his left temple to his jaw. Wade Brennan had a reputation that stretched from Tombstone to Tucson, and none of it was good. "Morning, McKinnon," Brennan called out, his voice carrying the false friendliness of a snake oil salesman. "Looks like you got yourself some predator troubles." His companions, a heavy-set Mexican with gold teeth and a younger man whose nervous energy reminded McKinnon of a rabid dog, remained silent but alert. All 3 wore their gun belts low and loose. McKinnon kept his own hand near his weapon but didn't draw. "Nothing I can't handle, Brennan. This is private property, and you're not welcome here." The words came out steady despite the ice forming in his gut. He'd heard the stories about Brennan's crew, about ranchers who'd refused their protection and later found their cattle dead, their wells poisoned, their families terrorized in the dead of night. Brennan's scarred face split into a grin that never reached his eyes. "See, that's where you're wrong, old man. Word is you've been harboring some unwelcome guests up in those caves near Devil's Canyon. Apache friends of yours, maybe?" He leaned forward in his saddle, the leather creaking ominously. "Now, I got nothing against Indians, but these particular ones got something that belongs to my employer. Something real valuable that went missing from a cavalry supply train about 6 months back." The mention of the cave sent a chill down McKinnon's spine. He'd discovered the small band of elderly Apaches 3 weeks ago while tracking a wounded deer through the narrow canyon that bordered his property. 5 old men and 2 ancient women, the last survivors of a group that had somehow evaded both the reservation and the final roundup that had sent Geronimo and his followers into exile. They were living like ghosts in the high caves, surviving on whatever they could hunt or gather, too proud to surrender but too weak to fight. McKinnon had said nothing to them that first day, simply left a haunch of venison at the base of the cliff and ridden away. The next morning, he'd found a small bundle of medicinal herbs tied to his fence post, plants he recognized as useful for the lung sickness that had been plaguing his horses. An unspoken understanding had developed between them over the following weeks. He would leave food when he could spare it, they would share their knowledge of the land and its healing properties. It was an arrangement that violated every law and treaty in the territory, but McKinnon had stopped caring about such things when he'd buried his wife. "I don't know what you're talking about," McKinnon said, but he could see from Brennan's expression that the lie was transparent. The gunman's pale eyes glittered with amusement and something darker. "Course you don't," Brennan replied. "But maybe you'll remember better after we have ourselves a little conversation with your Apache friends. Boys and me, we got ways of helping folks recollect things they might have forgotten." He gestured to his companions, who began reaching for their rifles. "Now, you can point us toward them caves, or we can find them ourselves after we're done with you. Makes no difference to me, but I reckon it might to you." McKinnon's mind raced as he calculated his options. 3 armed men against 1, and they had him surrounded with nowhere to run. Even if he managed to draw fast enough to take one of them down, the others would gun him down before he could reload. But surrendering the location of the Apache camp wasn't an option either. Those old people had survived decades of warfare and persecution. They deserved better than to be hunted down like animals for whatever imagined treasure Brennan's mysterious employer believed they possessed. The decision came to him in a flash of desperate inspiration, born from years of living in harmony with the dangerous wildlife of the high desert. For the past month, he'd been tracking a massive grizzly bear that had been raiding ranches throughout the valley, a 1,000-pound monster driven from its usual territory by drought and desperation. The creature had killed 3 cattle on neighboring spreads and mauled a cowboy near Wilcox, but it had always vanished into the maze of canyons and arroyos before anyone could organize a proper hunt. McKinnon knew where the bear was denning, had found its prints near a hidden spring less than half a mile from where they now stood. The animal would be hungry, aggressive, and unpredictable after days without food. If he could somehow lead Brennan and his men into the bear's territory, the chaos might give both him and the Apaches the chance they needed to escape. "All right," McKinnon said, letting defeat creep into his voice. "I'll take you to them. But we need to go on foot from here. The trail's too narrow for horses, and they'll hear us coming if we ride up there making noise." He gestured toward the rocky slopes that led up into Devil's Canyon, hoping his voice sounded convincingly resigned. Brennan studied him for a long moment, those pale eyes searching for signs of deception. Finally, he nodded and swung down from his saddle. "Smart man. Diego, you stay with the horses. Jake and me will go with our friend here for a little hike." The heavy-set Mexican grunted his acknowledgement and dismounted, while the younger gunman, Jake, practically vibrated with excitement as he checked his weapons. As they began climbing the rocky trail that led toward the canyon, McKinnon felt sweat beading on his forehead despite the cool mountain air. His plan was desperate, possibly suicidal, and depended on timing that would need to be perfect. The bear's den was located in a grove of oak trees near the hidden spring, about halfway between their current position and the caves where the Apaches were hiding. If he could lead Brennan and Jake close enough to disturb the grizzly, the resulting chaos might give him the chance to escape and warn his Apache friends. But as they climbed higher into the wilderness, McKinnon couldn't shake the feeling that he was being watched. Not by Brennan's remaining man down below, but by eyes that held ancient wisdom and understood the intricate dance between predator and prey that governed life in these unforgiving mountains. The Apaches had survived this long by knowing things that white men had forgotten, by reading signs in the landscape that others couldn't see. Perhaps they already knew what was coming. Perhaps they were already preparing for it in ways that McKinnon couldn't even imagine. The thought both comforted and terrified him as he led 2 armed killers deeper into the heart of the wilderness, toward a confrontation that would change everything he thought he knew about the delicate balance between civilization and the savage beauty of the untamed West. The scent hit McKinnon first, a musky combination of wet fur and rotting meat that made his nostrils flare with recognition. They were close now, perhaps 50 yards from the hidden spring where the massive grizzly had made its temporary den. Behind him, Jake's nervous breathing had grown more labored as they climbed, while Brennan moved with the predatory silence of a man accustomed to stalking human prey. Neither of them had noticed the subtle changes in the forest around them, the way the birds had fallen silent and the insects had stopped their constant buzzing. McKinnon's heart hammered against his ribs as he led them through a narrow gap between 2 towering boulders, the natural gateway that marked the entrance to the bear's territory. His plan was simple in its desperation. Get close enough to disturb the grizzly, then use the chaos to escape while Brennan and Jake dealt with 1,000 pounds of enraged predator. It wasn't much of a strategy, but it was the only card he had left to play. "How much further?" Brennan whispered, his scarred face glistening with sweat despite the cool mountain air. The gunman's pale eyes darted constantly from shadow to shadow, some primitive instinct warning him that they were entering a place where human weapons might not be enough. "Just over that ridge," McKinnon replied, pointing toward a cluster of oak trees that concealed the spring. "They like to camp near water, but they post sentries. We'll need to be careful." The lie came easily, born from the desperate hope that his gamble would pay off. As they crested the small rise, the sound of running water became audible, a gentle babbling that seemed incongruously peaceful in the tense atmosphere. McKinnon could see the spring now, a clear pool fed by an underground stream that emerged from a crack in the granite cliff face. And there, partially concealed by the twisted branches of an ancient oak, was the dark opening of the cave where the grizzly had taken refuge. But something was wrong. The cave mouth, which should have been shrouded in darkness, seemed to flicker with an odd, reddish light. McKinnon blinked hard, wondering if his eyes were playing tricks on him, but the strange illumination persisted. It pulsed gently, like the glow of banked coals, and with it came a sound that made his blood freeze in his veins. It wasn't the expected growl of an awakening bear, but something far more unsettling. A low, rhythmic chanting in a language that predated the arrival of white men in this valley by countless generations. The ancient Apache words seemed to flow from the cave like water, carrying with them a power that made the air itself feel thick and electric. Brennan had heard it too. The gunman's hand dropped instinctively to his weapon, but his movements were hesitant, uncertain. "What the hell is that?" he whispered, his voice tight with a fear he was trying hard to suppress. Before McKinnon could answer, a figure emerged from the shadowy forest behind them. It was Nailnish, the eldest of the Apache survivors, a man whose weathered face told the story of 8 decades spent navigating the brutal realities of desert warfare. His dark eyes held no surprise at their presence, only a deep sadness that seemed to encompass the entire tragic history of his people. "You have brought death to this sacred place, McKinnon," the old man said in English that was surprisingly clear despite his heavy accent. "But perhaps it was meant to be. The bear spirit has been waiting for you to fulfill your part of the bargain." Brennan spun around, his Colt clearing leather with practiced speed, but Jake was faster, his nervous energy finally finding an outlet as he drew his own weapon and leveled it at the Apache elder. "Don't move, old man, or I'll put a bullet through that wrinkled hide of yours." Nailnish ignored the threats completely, his attention focused entirely on McKinnon. "2 winters ago, when the Mexican bandits came to your ranch, you prayed to any god who would listen to bring you the power to protect what you loved. The bear spirit heard that prayer, but your woman was already beyond saving. So he waited, knowing that someday you would need his help again." The words hit McKinnon like a physical blow. He'd never spoken to anyone about that terrible night, about the desperate bargains he tried to make with whatever forces might be listening as Martha died in his arms. How could this old Apache know about prayers whispered in the darkness of a burning barn? "You're talking crazy, old man," Brennan snarled, but his voice carried less conviction than before. The strange chanting from the cave had grown louder, and now it was accompanied by sounds that defied rational explanation. Heavy footsteps that seemed too measured, too purposeful to belong to any ordinary animal. Nailnish smiled, revealing teeth worn down by decades of chewing tough desert plants. "Crazy? Perhaps. But the bear spirit knows the scent of men who kill for pleasure, who take life without honor or necessity. He has been waiting for such men to enter his domain." The old man's eyes shifted to Brennan and Jake, and something in that gaze made both gunmen take an involuntary step backward. The chanting stopped abruptly, leaving a silence so complete that McKinnon could hear his own heart beating. Then, from the depths of the cave, came a sound that belonged to no natural creature. It was a growl, but underneath it was something else, something that sounded almost like human speech twisted into an alien form. The grizzly that emerged from the cave was enormous, even by the standards of the massive bears that roamed the southwestern mountains. But it was the creature's eyes that made McKinnon's breath catch in his throat. They glowed with the same reddish light he'd seen flickering in the cave mouth, and they held an intelligence that was both ancient and utterly inhuman. Jake's nerve broke first. He screamed, a high-pitched sound of pure terror, and began firing wildly at the approaching bear. His bullet struck the massive creature but seemed to have no effect whatsoever. The grizzly didn't even slow down, just continued its measured approach with the inevitability of an avalanche. Brennan was made of sterner stuff, but even his seasoned nerves cracked as he watched his partner's bullets pass harmlessly through the bear's thick hide. He managed to get off 3 shots before the creature reached him, and McKinnon heard the distinctive whistle of lead passing through empty air where solid flesh should have been. The attack, when it came, was swift and brutal. The grizzly's massive paw struck Brennan across the chest with enough force to lift the gunman off his feet and hurl him against the trunk of a nearby pine tree. The sickening crack of breaking ribs echoed through the clearing, followed by Brennan's agonized scream. Jake tried to run, but the bear was faster, its enormous jaws closing around the young man's torso with a crunch that cut his fleeing cry short. McKinnon stood frozen, waiting for his own death, but it never came. The bear turned those glowing eyes on him for a long moment, and in their depths he saw something that might have been recognition, even approval. Then the massive creature simply faded away like morning mist, taking the bodies of the two gunmen with it. Nailnish approached McKinnon slowly, his ancient face grave but not unsympathetic. "The bear spirit has honored the compact," he said quietly. "You used him to protect my people, as he once wished to protect your woman. The debt is paid." The old man paused, studying McKinnon's shocked expression. "But there is more you must understand, rancher. The bear was never wild. He was the guardian of this valley long before your people came here, bound by ancient agreements to protect those who could not protect themselves." "I don't understand," McKinnon whispered, his voice hoarse with shock and disbelief. "Your wife," Nailnish continued, "she knew. In her final moments, she made her own bargain with the spirits of this land. Her death bound the bear to you, but only for when you truly needed him. Today, you needed him not for yourself, but for others who had no one else to fight for them. That is why he came." McKinnon sank to his knees beside the spring, overwhelmed by revelations that challenged everything he thought he knew about the world. "Martha," he breathed. "She's been watching over me all this time?" The old Apache nodded solemnly. "The dead do not rest easy when they leave unfinished business behind. Your woman's spirit could not move on knowing you would face the years ahead alone and unprotected. So she made arrangements." He gestured toward the cave where the bear had vanished. "But now the compact is complete. She can rest, and you can choose your own path forward." As the sun began to set over the Dragoon Mountains, painting the desert sky in shades of gold and crimson, McKinnon found himself faced with a choice that would define the rest of his life. He could return to his solitary ranch, mourning what he had lost while the years passed by in bitter isolation. Or he could accept the responsibility that Martha's sacrifice had prepared him for, becoming a guardian for those who had no one else to protect them. Looking into Nailnish's wise old eyes, McKinnon realized the choice had already been made for him long ago, in the moments when his dying wife had whispered her love into the smoke-filled darkness of their burning home. The widowed rancher who had climbed these mountains that morning no longer existed. In his place stood something new, a man bound by ancient pacts and sacred obligations to serve as a bridge between two worlds. As they walked back down the mountain together, the old Apache and the transformed rancher, neither of them spoke of the glowing eyes that watched their descent from the shadows of the high places, or of the promise that had been sealed in blood and sacrifice on this day when the spirits of the dead finally found their rest. The descent from the sacred spring took place in contemplative silence, but as they reached the lower slopes where Diego waited with the horses, McKinnon realized their troubles were far from over. The heavy-set Mexican had heard the gunshots and screams echoing from the canyon above, and his gold teeth flashed in a nervous grin as he leveled his rifle at the approaching figures. "Where are Senor Brennan and Jake?" Diego called out, his accented English thick with suspicion. "And who is this viejo you bring with you?" His dark eyes darted between McKinnon and Nailnish, seeking signs of treachery or violence that might explain his companion's absence. McKinnon felt the weight of the moment settling on his shoulders like a lead blanket. The compact with the bear spirit had resolved the immediate threat, but Diego represented a loose end that could unravel everything. Behind the Mexican's nervous bravado, McKinnon could see the calculating mind of a man who survived by reporting back to dangerous employers. Whatever organization had sent Brennan's crew would not simply accept the disappearance of their agents without investigation. "There was an accident," McKinnon said carefully, his hands held where Diego could see them. "A bear. Biggest grizzly I've ever seen. Your friends didn't make it." The truth had a bitter taste, even though he knew the men had deserved their fate. Diego's expression shifted from suspicion to fear, then to something harder and more dangerous. "You lie, gringo. Brennan was too smart, too fast. No bear could take him down." The rifle barrel swung toward Nailnish. "This Apache, he knows something. Maybe his people killed my compadres, eh? Maybe we need to have ourselves a little talk about what really happened up there." The old Apache stepped forward with the fearless dignity of a man who had faced death so many times that it had become an old acquaintance. "Your friends came to murder innocent people for gold that exists only in greedy dreams," Nailnish said, his voice carrying the authority of countless seasons survived in this harsh land. The mountain spirits do not suffer such men to defile sacred places. Superstitious nonsense, Diego spat, but McKinnon noticed how his hands trembled slightly as he maintained his aim. There ain't no spirits, just men with guns and the will to use them. And right now, I got both. His finger tightened on the trigger. Last chance, viejo. Tell me where Brennan is, or I'll send you to meet whatever spirits you believe in. The crack of the rifle shot echoed off the canyon walls, but it was Diego who crumpled to the ground, a neat hole punched through his chest by a bullet fired from somewhere in the rocks above. McKinnon spun around, searching for the shooter, but Nailnish merely nodded as if he had been expecting this development all along. My grandson has been watching from the high places, the old man explained as a younger Apache warrior emerged from his concealment among the boulders. The newcomer moved with the fluid grace of someone born to this landscape, his weathered features bearing a strong resemblance to Nailnish despite the decades that separated their ages. Ayana learned the white man's way of fighting during the reservation years, but he never forgot the old skills. Ayana approached them with his rifle still at the ready, his dark eyes taking in the scene with professional assessment. When he spoke, his English carried the precise diction of someone educated in government schools but never fully tamed by them. The one called Brennan had friends in Tombstone. They will come looking when he fails to return. He gestured toward Diego's body. This one was to send word back using the telegraph in Benson. His silence will be noted. McKinnon felt the walls closing in around him as the full implications became clear. By protecting the Apache survivors, he had declared war on forces he didn't fully understand. Brennan had mentioned an employer, someone wealthy and powerful enough to hire professional killers to track down a handful of elderly Indians. That kind of enemy didn't simply disappear when their hired guns failed to return. What was it they thought you had stolen? McKinnon asked, looking between grandfather and grandson. Brennan mentioned something taken from a cavalry supply train. Nailnish and Ayana exchanged a look that carried decades of shared history and understood suffering. Finally, the old man reached into his shirt and withdrew a small leather pouch, its surface worn smooth by countless hands over many years. Not stolen, he said quietly. Saved from those who would use it for evil purposes. The pouch contained what appeared to be a simple piece of crystalline rock, no larger than a man's thumb and unremarkable except for the way it seemed to capture and hold the fading daylight. But as McKinnon looked more closely, he could see veins of silver running through the crystal's heart, creating patterns that shifted and changed as he watched. The cavalry was transporting this to mining interests in California, Ayana explained. A sample taken from sacred caves in the Chiricahua Mountains, places where our ancestors spoke with the earth spirits for 1,000 generations. The white men believe it contains valuable metals, but they do not understand its true nature. Nailnish closed the pouch reverently. This stone is a conduit, a bridge between the world of the living and the realm of the spirits. In the wrong hands, it could be used to enslave the very forces that maintain the balance between order and chaos. The cavalry soldiers who carried it began to sicken and die within days, their souls consumed by powers they could not comprehend. So you took it, McKinnon said, understanding beginning to dawn. You risked everything to keep it out of their hands. My people have been guardians of such things since the beginning times, the old man replied. We understood the responsibility even as the blue soldiers pursued us into the deepest wilderness. Better to die protecting the balance than to live knowing we had allowed ancient evils to be awakened. The sound of distant hoofbeats interrupted their conversation, approaching from the direction of McKinnon's ranch. Ayana melted back into the rocks with practiced efficiency while Nailnish tucked the sacred stone away. McKinnon drew his Colt and waited, wondering if Diego had managed to send word before confronting them or if other members of Brennan's organization had grown suspicious of their silence. 3 riders emerged from the gathering dusk, but these were not more hired killers. McKinnon recognized Sheriff Tom Bradshaw from Tombstone, a weathered man whose reputation for fairness had earned him respect from both sides of the law. With him rode Deputy Martinez and a younger man McKinnon didn't recognize, someone whose expensive clothes and soft hands marked him as an Easterner despite the gun belted at his hip. Evening, Thomas, Bradshaw called out as he reined in his horse. His eyes took in the scene with the practiced assessment of a man who had dealt with violence in all its forms. Diego's body lay where he had fallen, and the sheriff's expression grew grim as he dismounted. "Looks like you've had some trouble out here." "Uninvited visitors, Sheriff," McKinnon replied carefully. "This one tried to rob me at gunpoint. I was forced to defend myself." The lie came easily, supported by Diego's position and the rifle that lay beside his outstretched hand. The well-dressed stranger stepped forward, his pale eyes examining Diego's corpse with clinical interest. "This man was in the employ of my associates," he said in a cultured Boston accent that seemed jarringly out of place in the desert landscape. "I am Dr. Harrison Blackwood, representing certain mining interests that have been tracking stolen property through this region." Bradshaw's expression darkened. "You didn't mention anything about stolen property when you asked for my assistance, Doctor. You said you were looking for missing employees." Blackwood's smile held no warmth. "A necessary simplification, Sheriff. The details involve matters of national security that are beyond your jurisdiction. Suffice it to say that 3 of my men came to this area following reports of Apache raiders in possession of materials taken from a federal transport. It appears they encountered more resistance than anticipated." McKinnon felt Nailnish's presence behind him like a gathering storm. The old Apache had not moved or spoken, but something in the air around him seemed to thicken with suppressed power. The sacred stone in his possession was reacting to Blackwood's proximity, and McKinnon wondered what other abilities the crystal might possess beyond serving as a bridge between worlds. "I haven't seen any Apache raiders," McKinnon said, meeting Blackwood's gaze steadily. "Just this man and his friends, who seemed more interested in murder than any kind of legitimate business." He gestured toward Diego's body. "If they were working for you, Doctor, you might want to reconsider your hiring practices." Blackwood's eyes glittered with barely controlled anger, but before he could respond, the desert around them began to change in ways that defied rational explanation. The air grew thick and electric, charged with the same energy McKinnon had felt near the bear's cave. Shadows lengthened despite the dying light, stretching toward the assembled men like grasping fingers. And from somewhere in the distance came the sound of drums, beating out a rhythm that seemed to emerge from the very bones of the earth itself. Sheriff Bradshaw's horse whinnied nervously and shied away from something only it could sense. "What in the hell?" the lawman muttered, his hand dropping instinctively to his gun. Even Deputy Martinez, who had grown up in this country and heard all the old stories, looked genuinely frightened as the drumbeat grew stronger. "The stone," Blackwood whispered, his cultured facade cracking to reveal something desperate and hungry underneath. "It's here. I can feel it calling." He turned toward Nailnish with predatory intensity. "You have it, don't you, old man? The crystalline matrix my associates have been seeking. Give it to me, and I might allow you to live long enough to see another sunrise." Nailnish finally spoke, his voice carrying the weight of centuries and the authority of spirits that had never bowed to any earthly power. "You speak of things you do not understand, seeker of forbidden knowledge. The sacred stone has chosen its guardians, and they are not men who sell their souls for gold and power." The confrontation that followed would become legend among the Apache survivors and their descendants, a story passed down through generations about the night when the ancient powers stirred from their long slumber to defend those who had remained faithful to the old ways. But for McKinnon, caught between worlds he was still learning to understand, it was the moment when his transformation from broken rancher to guardian of sacred mysteries finally became complete, sealed by choices that would echo through the remainder of his days.